Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog. Good evening. I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Tonight, the subject is robots. As robots become an important part of modern life, there is concern about some of their potential uses and the prospect of their autonomy. To clarify the role and capabilities of robots, we're most fortunate to have David Mindell of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, an expert in several areas of robotics, plus author of several popular books on the subject. Dr. Mindell is a professor of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and also the Dibner Professor of the History of Engineering and Manufacturing at MIT. He has 25 years of experience as an engineer in undersea robotic exploration, including many oceanographic expeditions, and also as a pilot and engineer of autonomous aircraft. Because he emphasizes the social and cognitive aspects of the relationship between humans and the field of robotics, he brings a unique perspective to this science. Dr. Mindell has degrees in literature and in electrical engineering from Yale University and a doctorate in the history of technology from MIT. He's a senior member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, the IEEE, an associate fellow of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and a fellow of the Explorers Club of New York City. Dr. Mindell is the author of several award-winning books for the general public, and the most recent of those books is the focus of tonight's discussion. For titles and other information about his other books, please see tonight's event page on our website. It is a great honor to welcome David Mindell. Welcome, Dr. Mindell.
Thank you, Yvonne. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm looking forward to learning all about robots tonight. The first thing is this kind of issues. We start with a little bit of background, if we could. There are several concerns about robots, and one of those is that it will replace human labor. Another is robots in the uses for war, and another one is that we will merge humans and robots in some way. First off, what about humans and labor?
Well, we've had a complicated relationship with our machines for a very long time around the issue of labor. What you find with robots is that, as you found with mechanized machines before them, rarely do they simply come in and do a human job and replace that job. They always come in and change the nature of the job, change the nature of task, rearrange the people around. And the robots themselves are, of course, put there by other people, so they're always embedded in these kind of social relationships around work, which isn't to say that people aren't displaced, moved around. In certain places, they certainly do lose their jobs. Other places, there are more jobs around these things. You have to always look at them as part of a larger system.
Right, so presumably humans would move off to new kinds of work, leaving this very mechanical. A lot of that use in labor is very mechanical.
At the moment it is,
yes,
and one of the questions is what happens when it becomes less mechanical.
Precisely,
right.
Which is an area I guess you've touched on a bit. How about war?
Very interesting topic. I've studied war for my whole career. It's an extreme environment. The book is really about extreme environments. Warfare, like spaceflight, has always been an advanced user of technology. So there are lessons that have been learned in these extreme environments about how robots are used, how they change the nature of the work, how they play out, that are useful to thinking about robotics in more everyday life in the years to come. At the same time, war is a place where life and death is at stake.
Yeah.
The professional identities are very strong. The ethical questions are very strong. So again, a lot of aspects of daily life are sort of heightened and brought to their extreme and it's a good place to study, and also a very important topic for the world that we live in.
Right. There's a lot of, I mean, there are organizations getting started now and very prominent scientists like Stephen Hawking are even worried about this. What are the concerns? Can you say what it is that makes people anxious about?
Well, there's a kind of cultural mythology of killer robots, which has been around for a long time, that very much
Since
informs
sci-fi.
people's imagination. I actually think many people in the military are also very concerned that they keep the life and death decisions in human hands at some point. And what does that actually mean, and how do you kind of negotiate that? So, how could you possibly unleash a decision to kill other people to a machine that you don't entirely understand what it's going to do?
Right.
That's a very important topic. At the moment, U.S. military policy is not to do that, and to keep the human somewhere in the approval chain, which I think is very important. And there are some forces pushing to change that, others resisting that, even within the military. So, and then there's the kind of larger social question of, what is warfare really about? Is it really kind of legitimate warfare to just unleash machines? But maybe that's okay if the machines are just fighting other machines.
Other machines,
that's maybe an okay outcome as well. So far it hasn't been that. So far it's only, war has only been automated on one end of the equation, and the people on the receiving end haven't always fared as well. And at the same time, there are people alive today in our country and in our town who may not be if it weren't for a robot helping out with some of the tasks in the recent wars that our country's fought. So and the political and military environment we're in constantly changes. So the robots that evolved in the last wars won't be the ones that evolve in the next wars.
Right. And we'll probably come back to this in a little while, because you've said some very interesting things in this book about it. But I'd like to then ask just this other concern. I'm not sure whether it's always concerned, the merge of our minds with robots, and that goes certainly way back. What do you think about that?
In some way, I think when you talk about robots, it's more interesting to think about the merge of our bodies, and and how our minds explore through our robots, right? In some ways, I used to work on robots in the oceanographic world, and people would always, there was a lot of talk about them like robots, but in some way they were most like telescopes when they worked well. If our users, who were mostly scientists, were talking about the robot, then we had failed as engineers. That wasn't the job. We wanted the scientists talking about the ocean, that robot was just a way of them to look around in the ocean. That's when we succeeded, when the robot became invisible and just like a kind of appendage that you saw through. And there are many, many uses of robots that are very productive that way.
Exactly, and that's a major point in this particular book, I think. But one of the concerns has been, well, it's not always concerned, but there are some people like Ray Kurzweil and Minsky and some of these AI people who've been very enthusiastic. Let's just dump our heads. We're into robots, and we're going to become a new species. What do you think? Is this
well, I think,
long shot?
For people who think that our entire being exists within our heads, that's one way to approach it. I think even in the last 30 years, since a lot of those ideas first formed, we've come to different notions about identity and different notions about cognition. To begin with, that cognition is a lot less separable from the body than people had used to think, that the mind is not some pure machine that just happens to live in a body, that how we process the world has very much to do with both our bodies and our brains, on the one hand. Secondly, that actually also cognition is something that is not locked within the skin, but is distributed through social networks, and that there's an idea called distributed cognition, which I find very compelling, that in many cases the cognition that you find that's really interesting and important is the one that's done within groups of people, and even for the sort of things I'm interested in, groups of machines and groups of people. And it's the sum total of those that does the thinking. That's what's interesting. In today's world, there was the kind of classic Deep Blue versus Kasparov,
Yes.
chess, the pure brain versus the pure computer. But in today's world, the best chess player is a person with a computer,
Yeah.
or several people with several computers. That's the best chess player we can think of, and I think that analogy extends to a lot of other areas as well.
Right. It's also a set kind of thinking as opposed to cognition in a maybe broader sense, that the sorts of things that these robotic systems maybe do very well,
Yeah.
like play chess, is not everyday cognition. It's not the
Right.
kind of
I mean,
creative
if
cognition.
you believe that
as-
cognition is purely symbolic processing that
Yes,
happens
there,
only within
right,
the head,
right.
which is the foundation of a lot of,
Yes,
of
I
the
see.
cognitive sciences, then that you'll approach the problem one way. A more modern view, I think, is again, that cognition is both very much related to the senses and the body,
Yeah.
and a lot of cognitive processing happens on both of those stems, and that also that it's very distributed and interactive, and often sometimes even difficult to figure out where the borders
Yeah.
are between linked entities.
Right. It's very interesting that you make this differentiation, and I hope you'll do a book on this. In this book, you started out with 3 myths, and it sort of sets up the whole theme. They're really useful. It's a very useful way of thinking. So the 3 of them, one was the myth of linear progress. What's the myth?
So the myth of linear progress is an idea that I subscribed to very much in the 1990s, which was that we had, that then they were called manned vehicles. Still a lot of people call them manned vehicles, or
right.
human-occupied vehicles, like cars today.
Right.
And that then technology would move toward remotely operated
Yeah.
vehicles, which was a human going through some kind of communications link and operating a remote control. And then toward autonomous vehicles, and that this idea of the autonomous vehicle that operated completely on its own was somehow the highest expression of technology, and that technology was naturally moving along that progression. And I certainly believed that, and I got involved in operating remote vehicles and beginning some of the early autonomous vehicles in the ocean. It was very exciting. And what we found over time, though, was that that was not a linear progression for a couple of reasons. First of all, the manned vehicles stuck around and didn't actually disappear. So Woods Hole still operates a submersible called Alvin, which has 3 people, sends it down to the seafloor, and that they've been operating that since 1964, and it's still there. And there are remote vehicles, there are autonomous vehicles. They're all operated together, and actually they're mixed in those operations in very interesting ways. They each have strengths, they each have weaknesses, and in various settings they're operated. But secondly, actually the borderline between what's manned, what's remote, and what's autonomous is constantly now blurring, and it's even harder to draw those lines where you can see they're all different kinds of interesting hybrids, and those hybrids are operating together. So plus the autonomous vehicles, and this gets to the third myth of the myth of autonomy, in some ways the full autonomous vehicle is an easier problem than building a vehicle or a robot that really works richly with other people and in a kind of social work environment. And that's actually the most challenging problem. Not that we're kind of naturally gravitating towards this idea of full autonomy, but rather that operating within a human environment in a beautiful, balanced, kind of trusted way is actually the hardest and the most interesting, and I think the most worthwhile problem.
And you've called this a complementary kind of relationship, and it has become indispensable in many kinds of work. So, in terms of the myth of replacement, then we're not going to be replaced. Is that the idea?
Well, in many cases, I think the people are often moved around, sometimes through the other end of a telemetry link or through a computational system, or human intentions are embedded in software. But there are always people in these systems if you know how to look for them.
So we're not going to be replaced in the complete sense. And then you are concerned that this idea of full autonomy is also, you call it a myth in that sense.
Yeah, or I think it's a myth that it's somehow the highest expression of the technology.
I see, yes.
I think full autonomy is something that is a very interesting object to think with. It's a very good research problem. It looks very nice to people who work in laboratories because it's almost always robots operating in a kind of manufactured environment that's free of a lot of different interferences. And what I saw there's 30 or 40 examples in the book of as robots move from the laboratory into real environments, the human embeddedness is gradually kind of added in. And so time after time you see these ideas, oh, we're going to build this fully autonomous vehicle, it's unmanned, and then gradually as it gets, it still does really interesting things, there's still legitimate robots, they still operate, but either the autonomy is bounded in time, it's relatively short-lived, or it's bounded in space, and there's a lot of discussion about sort of how that works. And so, if you think about airplanes, which is something I work with a lot, the fully autonomous airliner takes off from an airport, flies through some airspace, maybe even avoids a thunderstorm and some weather, and then lands at another airport. We solved that problem. 10 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, that problem is put to bed. For an airliner to take off from an airport that other people are using, carry people, fly over people's houses and other people who are on the ground, fly through airspace that other airplanes are using, land at another airport that people are using, that's a tremendously challenging problem. We've only begun to think through that problem. So the autonomy, the full autonomy, is sort of separated out from its social embeddedness. That's an easy problem. I mean, it's not easy. I don't mean to belittle it, but it's relatively straightforward. Same thing with the automobile problem. Drive on a perfectly clean highway, drive in a very clean, ordered suburban environment, relatively straightforward. Drive in a crowded, messy urban environment where there's a lot of people around and you're deeply embedded in social networks. We're only beginning to think that one through.
There's a lot of hype about the autonomous car, and you do make a fine point about that. That it's really complicated if you do have a social basis when you are driving in an urban environment. Period. And we're not there yet in terms of
from MIT who said, driving is hundreds of short-lived social contracts.
That's really
and it's a very good way to describe it.
Really,
and
especially
robots
Boston.
aren't even really, I mean, roboticists and computer scientists aren't even beginning to understand those short-lived social contracts. They're not even doing research in that.
Which takes us to the issue of the kind of learning. It has been part of, I guess, the mythology that it is a question of time before robots will learn like humans. What's the story on that? Can robots learn like humans learn?
Oh, well, that's a very complicated question. I'm not sure I'm the best person I certainly can't resolve it. There are some amazing things in machine learning and deep learning, what people have called lately, where robots and other kinds of AI systems can draw on large databases and begin to distinguish things. But they're still very specialized applications where there's a tremendous amount of human setup and human selection of the data. And there's one good example where you can go out and you can train an algorithm on the internet to look at millions of pictures and pick out school buses, and people have done that, and they can say, this is a school bus, there's a school bus. But somebody else has shown, once you take that algorithm that's been trained, it's very easy to fool it into thinking it sees a school bus by giving it a little mix of yellow and white and black stripes and a wheel here and there, and something that a human would never think is a school bus. These algorithms are very easily spoofed into. And so they're tremendously valuable for certain kinds of tasks. there's still a tremendous amount of human input into. I mean, you know, all data is a social product, right? Any kind of data that's out there has been created, selected, and other things have been eliminated by a person. So there is no kind of neutral data in that sense. And any scientist actually knows that, because data is such a rich human product, and good data is a great human product. So even if you have an algorithm that learns through data, data has to come from somewhere. It's sort of selected that way. I actually, in the book, I make a point of saying, I make no claim about whether these systems are intelligent or not. I don't get into the debate about intelligence. What I do say is they're not inhuman. They're still very shaped by human thoughts about what the thing might be good for, what the data is good for, who might be using it, what the task is. And if those things are well crafted, they can work very well.
I'd like to go to your very rich experience with robots and these remote systems and so on. Would you trot us through your experience, say, at Woods Hole?
Sure. I mean, when I was first out of school in the 1980s, I was very fortunate to land a job at the Oceanographic Institution at Woods Hole as an engineer. And I joined Bob Ballard's group a few years after they had found the Titanic. So it was an exciting time. The Cold War was ending. And we were bringing online one of the first remote robots, certainly probably the first remote robot that was designed explicitly to do science in the deep ocean with, called Jason. And then kind of followed Jason through its maturation process and teething pains over the course of that decade with many other wonderful colleagues and engineers down there. And this is, you know, that experience has shaped my whole career and my scholarly work since then. There were scientists who said, you can never send a robot to the deep ocean. It could never do oceanography. You know, we have to be there. Only people can do oceanography. And they were right about that. And nobody really ever claimed a robot was going to do any science. The robot was down there collecting data. The robots didn't replace the scientists in any stretch. Robots turned out to be very good at digitizing the seafloor and at collecting a lot of data that then the scientists would analyze in the way that they typically did back at their labs or by looking at a map. And so there were these very interesting debates about, do you really need to physically visit the seafloor to be a real oceanographer? And there was a lot of interesting tension between the group that ran the manned submersibles and our group that was running the robots. And there were personalities involved, and there were professional pride involved, and those things evolved in ways that I found completely surprising. For example, the initial story about the robots was they were going to be cheaper and they were going to be safer. And they turned out not to be cheaper and not to be safer. They weren't cheaper because you ran them 24 hours a day and you needed 3 shifts of people to operate them, and they had their own other expenses. They weren't safer because Alvin was very safe and still is today. And has never really had a serious accident or serious injury. And the robots, you know, we had a cable that had 30,000 pounds of tension on it and 2,500 volts on it, and going into a big vat of salt water known as the ocean. It wasn't a particularly safe thing, and there were all these kind of hidden dangers. But what the robots did do was totally transform the experience of exploring the seafloor. Rather than just 3 people going in Alvin at 9 in the morning and coming up at 5 o'clock, telling everyone what they saw, now you had 40 people in a room in real time kind of exploring together. So the social experience was what changed, and the kind of real-time seminar of exploration changed radically and was very rich. And that's again where the robots didn't replace the people in that sense at all. They changed the task, the social dimensions of the experience. And at the time we were looking at pretty crappy video by today's standards. But boy, if you were with a group of people watching that crappy video, you were transported to the seafloor, and you really felt like you were there. And there were limits to that feeling of presence too. And that was a remarkably rich thing to go through and to explore shipwrecks and find ancient history and hydrothermal vents and all kinds of interesting scientific expeditions that we did over the the course of the 90s and the early 2000s. And gradually then I started to see other fields go through similar evolutions where they realized that remotely operated systems are not scary killer robots. They're still operated by people, and they transmit people through wires to entirely new experiences.
Yes.
And that has its pros and it has its cons, and
Right.
and there's a set of phenomena that go on around that.
But it also opened up information that would have been certainly problematic in terms of obtaining, right? As I was thinking of the deep sea stuff,
Yeah.
because you can't always measure everything. It's incredibly hot or incredibly dark or all those things, and now it's wide open.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
much more open.
I mean, there were shipwreck sites that
Oh, it must
actually there
be.
were archaeologists who said you can't do archaeology with a robot, and we said a diver is never going to go 3,000 feet down.
Yeah.
They're just not going to do it. So it's this or nothing in that case.
Right. And you did discover a lot of stuff.
We
It
discovered a lot of
changed
stuff.
things.
We mapped it.
Yes.
And in many ways, I think we treated those sites a lot more responsibly than some of the shallow water wrecks that
Yeah.
divers would excavate and sort of extract the entire thing from the
Yeah.
ocean.
So that's one area you did a lot. Well, you've done so many things. How about the space exploration part? Is that changed radically from, I'm thinking of like the Mars exploration and so on. What's your take on what this will
I have a chapter in the
open?
book on the Mars rovers, and I think there's a lot of things that are in common with the work we experienced undersea. One of the big differences is the time delay. It's a 20-minute
Yes.
time delay to get commands up to those rovers and video and other signals
Yeah.
back. But that doesn't inhibit the scientists.
Right.
And, actually, it really wasn't my work, but a colleague of mine, Bill Clancy, did some really detailed studies of how the Mars rover scientists work. And they end up with a very strong sense of presence in the
Yes.
Martian landscape.
Yeah.
And you'd think that would be impossible with a 20-minute time delay, and yet they, again, partly because of the social nature of their work and the way they work through the robot. And again, the robots on Mars don't do any geology.
Right.
They're not robot geologists in any
Yeah,
sense.
right.
They're tools of human geologists on the Earth
Right.
that, they have a little bit of autonomous features. They'll go here and there. But they're very much under the command and returning their data to humans on the ground.
Right.
And so, that's also a very rich story. It's not exactly the same, but there are a lot of very common elements to our remote experience on
Right.
the
Well,
seafloor.
once again, that it simply opens up a world that you are more limited in, actually, if you're there, because it's a very hostile environment,
Right.
and you are limited. But
And people,
this is
when
just,
they're there, they're always in a hurry.
yes,
And
exactly.
these Mars rovers have operated for a decade.
Which is astounding,
Mm-hmm.
astounding. But it seems as though people working on this, as you say, are just amazed, and it changes their perspective substantially, evidently.
They would
one of your
literally,
best points.
in Pasadena, they would live for months, and they would go to work
Yeah.
on Mars every day.
Isn't that amazing?
And the most jarring part of that was driving back and forth from their home to the control room. And there's some similar things in oceanography where I've had colleagues now who have worked remotely from a studio not so different from this that Bob Ballard runs in Rhode Island, with a supposedly autonomous but really remote vehicle on the other side of the world. And my friend said, the only thing that they didn't get right about that arrangement, they should have had bunk beds in the studio, because the problem that was always driving to the motel at night, which was often 3 in the morning or 6 in the morning, and that broke the spell. If you could sleep inside the studio, you could fully live in this other world.
Be transported in a very different way.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, and it's an experience, I am sure, that's true. Okay, now you've worked on military stuff as well. What kinds of things, and what's your feeling about that?
I've mostly written about military things,
Okay.
and I've studied the first book I wrote actually was about the Civil War and how ironclad warships which were, in some
It's a
ways you might
big
say, the
innovation.
robots of their day, changed the experience of warfare for people. I think the Predator and Reaper drones, I don't really like that term for them, but that were used in Iraq and Afghanistan and are still used today, had a similar effect on people.
Yeah.
They were originally operated from relatively nearby, but they evolved to the point where they're operated from the continental United States,
Yeah.
even though they're flying on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
And that whole story is a very rich, interesting story. Again, the engineers who designed the thing imagined it would be a fully autonomous robot. They didn't even really give it much of a ground station. Why would you need an operator console for something that's unmanned? And it turned out to be used in an entirely different way. And it was really the users in the field under the pressure of war,
Yeah.
particularly after 9/11, that modified the system in such a way that it has a much, much more complex ground station now than it did when it came out from the manufacturer. And there are upwards of 150 people, more than 150 people that are required to operate it. The Air Force actually banned the term unmanned
Because
for these
it's
systems because
overly
they're so
manned.
labor intensive.
Yeah, right.
And it's a very intense, kind of rich, and also disturbing experience of war that these people have. They're sort of derided by their peers. They're
Yeah.
treated as armchair Nintendo warriors. Sometimes they're treated as sort of callous, remote, button-pushing killers. When the actual experience they have is a very unusual one, where they're very, they sit and observe a house for a week at a time,
Yeah.
and then maybe kill the people who are coming in and out of the house. They have a very intimate portrait of the warfare they're fighting. Their heads and their eyes are much closer involved than pilots who are flying aircraft above the battlefield who may just see a set of targets. And at the same time, their bodies are not physically there.
Exactly.
They don't get medals, they don't get combat pay.
Right.
But they do operate 6 days a week, 12-hour weeks on these incredibly long shifts without the sort of well-defined deployment of going overseas for 6 months and
Right.
coming back. It's
Right.
a very different experience.
So it's very stressful in many respects. I can appreciate that compared to, say, fighter planes, which are very remote from their targets, and that's a different experience. But I think we're not aware generally that this gets pretty intimate.
One
Predator
of them
type
wrote an
of
article
thing.
where he said, my buddies from training, mock me as an armchair warrior.
Right.
And I say to them, how many of you have watched a group of people for a week,
Yeah.
killed them, then watched their funeral and killed all those people too?
Wow.
And the Air Force did a study. They found about equivalent rates of post-traumatic stress disorder among
From the armchair
operators
warriors,
as
right?
they
Yeah,
do,
right.
which is remarkable given that
Right.
they aren't in physical danger.
Right.
They don't have, they're really not in physical danger. They too have to leave their trailer, drive
Right.
through the suburban streets and go live with their families.
Right.
That's not that new of experience compared to pilots have always lived behind the front lines
Yeah,
in different
yeah,
circumstances.
yeah, right.
But again, not quite for these extended multi-year periods.
Right. I didn't realize it's so prolonged, that their shifts, so to speak, are very prolonged, very, very stressful. I think it's come out now that it is very stressful, but it is a different experience from the typical
Yeah, it's been
battlefield kind of thing.
It's an evolved, again, since 9/11, an environment where there are never enough aircraft. There's a huge demand for the imagery they're generating.
Yeah.
There aren't enough operators. There's not a well-defined, it's better now, but training and reward and career promotion system. So the whole thing has been forced to evolve under the stresses of these two wars and other wars that we've been
Right.
fighting. You could say, well, maybe they could organize it differently. It wouldn't be so stressful. That may be the case, but it hasn't been done that way.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
a very interesting story. The book has an account of it that was written by a Ph.D. student of mine who is an Air Force officer who had a great deal of access to how these things are operated that's never been seen before, really. And he was a fighter pilot, actually. And so he was constantly comparing what he
The
saw
two
against
things makes a big
his
difference.
experience as a fighter pilot above Kosovo and Bosnia,
Right,
where he had
yeah.
actually had combat experience.
Right.
Very interesting story.
Yeah, as you speak, you are become very aware here of how much this is changing the human thinking, the way we experience a whole lot of things, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, the military is a really interesting place to study this.
Yeah.
Because, a military is a place where you have state-controlled fighting and dying.
Yeah.
And, human societies have developed very strong social traditions over many centuries to control the stresses and the excesses of those experiences. That's why the military is organized and almost literally has a different set of laws from the civilian world. And the professional identities are very strong there.
Yeah.
And they have a lot at stake, and they should have a lot at stake.
Mm-hmm.
I want people who are clean-cut, orderly, like
Sane.
operating big bombers. That's
Yes.
you need that, and it still goes wrong every once in a while, and so there's a lot of professional pride around that, and those things are all called into question when the physical body is not at risk in the fight, and that's really it's a social upheaval in the Air Force particularly, but in other services too, that is only barely being dealt with.
But
and
will
it's
be
a lot
dealt
more
with
complicated
more,
than I kind of went into this 10 years ago thinking it's the fighter pilots with the white scarves around their neck who don't want to give up anything up, and it's a lot richer story than actually that kind of resistance is a relatively small part of the story compared to other things.
So, but it's changing the way we do things now. What's an area of these robotic uses? I mean, they're in rescue, they're in mining, they're on all kinds of things in our lives today. But in your mind, is there any area that is of particular interest, particularly rich, potentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and there's a lot of people thinking about this, but again, what interests me is not full autonomy, but what I call situated autonomy. The autonomy within a human social environment.
Right.
Warfare, like it or not, is a human environment.
Right,
There's a lot of camaraderie, but conflict is a social relationship too. Whether it's a factory, whether it's an airport, whether it's a logistics center, whether it's a highway, how do you make these systems work where people can understand how they behave, feel that they can trust them, at least understand them well enough to know whether they're doing something brilliant or they're broken. That's a real problem. It's not easy to figure out that sometimes. And engineering that relationship is really the challenge. And again, if I look at the fields of computer science and robotics as it's traditionally defined, they're not even working on those problems. They're working on problems of perception and path planning, and, but
it's mechanical.
It's very kind of egocentric view of what a robot is, as opposed to how robots are kind of embedded in environments and relate to people, and at least don't get in the way, and maybe someday actually participate in human relationships of all the things that that we all experience that way.
Right. You've made a very big point, and I think you're the one or one of very few who sees where this really is, that it is complementary. This is where it is. You said robotics engineers are still, what do I want to say, very mechanically oriented this way and not looking at this. Will we proceed to start looking at this? It's much more interesting.
That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
And I think, there's a lot of people out there, for example, say, we're going to solve the problem of human-robot collaboration. Here's our new robot.
Yeah.
Okay, and you're not going to solve the problem of human-robot collaboration by just building a new robot.
Right.
You're going to have to really engineer this relationship in one way, and that requires different kinds of people with different kinds of skills. People with robotics and technical skills too, but also social scientists and organizational scientists. People who understand how to study work. People who understand the sort of, workplaces are like battlefields, rich,
Very
complicated,
often.
lots of, well, yeah, they're sometimes like battlefields too. But, you know, there's a lot at stake for everybody in a workplace.
Right.
And relatively well understood. I mean, a lot of
Yeah.
people have studied that for a long time, and a lot of that thinking is not very well incorporated into the kinds of robotic systems that are getting made today. So one of the things that really interests me is how do you really begin to, there's a lot of good robots out there. I don't expect to build robots, but how do you build
The system, it's a different
that really
system.
can engage with people and be the equivalent of that human computer chess team,
Yeah.
and do better than either can do on their own.
Exactly, that complementary arrangement. Since you teach, do students understand where this is going, or do they tend to be very mechanically, or so you
Well,
know?
I teach at MIT,
I
so
know.
there's a certain kind of student there.
Right.
On the one hand,
Right.
and there is a very strong kind of, we can figure out the algorithm to do the social relationship, and let's work
There's
on
an algorithm for
optimizing
that,
it,
right?
And
Yeah,
there are
I
really
understand
people who
that.
work on that.
Right.
At the same time, I think MIT actually has a very long and rich tradition, which I've actually written in one of my earlier books, starting with Norbert Wiener and cybernetics,
yeah,
and actually much earlier than him, about really trying to think about machines in relationship to people and how you engineer people. And Marvin Minsky, who you mentioned, these people are all kind of part of that tradition.
Yeah.
And the cognitive sciences have emerged roughly in parallel with a lot of the computer sciences. And in our own way, there are a lot of different people at MIT working on similar set of problems. Because MIT as an institution is a place that's very embedded in the world. It's not
Absolutely.
It's not all that
Absolutely.
ivory tower.
Exactly.
The borders around MIT are very porous. People are constantly moving in and out. That's one of the great strengths of the place.
Right.
Some of the pure, you know, some people find that very compromised. I find it exciting.
Yeah. Well, that it is true. They say somebody once said that. Well, that's one place where you can have anarchy. Everything is just fine because it's very fluid, very open to a lot of things. It does not the typical academic closed machine shop.
And at the same time, the world is moving.
Yeah.
There's big emphasis on data. A lot of people think you can automate education through computers and video.
Right.
And we're learning the limits of that as we go. So it's a constant kind of back and forth.
Right. You've been so innovative all your career. You've done so many interesting things. You have also started a business, correct? Could you tell us about it?
Sure. It's called Hugh Maddux. It's the first 4 letters of human and the last 4 letters of robotics, with the human first. So broadly speaking, our goal is, again, to figure out how to design robots and robotic systems that are oriented around humans and the kind of integrity of human work, and how to strengthen and relate to people doing the kind of work that they're very good at. As we say, automating people in rather than automating people out.
Right.
And so we're building some very innovative sensors out of new kinds of electronics that will allow, again, these relationships to be better understood. But we also have, organizational experts and human experience, user experience people, and we're really integrating the kind of human design, not just into an interface where you get a beautiful sort of flashy picture to operate or a pair of eyelashes that'll blink at you and make you feel good, but rather really engineering the core of the robots to fit within human work systems. And that's a big job, that's a big topic, but there's a great need for it. And one of the things we're finding is that a little bit of it goes a really long way, right? So we don't claim to have all this figured out. It's a very long project to get it. But boy, if you just think about who your users are a little bit, you build a much better robot than a lot of other robots.
It's
if you
a
think
real
about
innovation.
why people are afraid of autonomy, because they hate it when things don't do what they expect, and you put even a little bit of effort into having an autonomous system communicate why it's doing what it's doing,
Yeah.
people have a much easier time relating to it.
Very interesting.
So, but most systems that are built today don't do that.
Right, we're familiar with that. That's absolutely true, and it keeps hitting a block. It seems like. So, how old is the company, and are you're I don't know how you do all these different things.
It's about 10 months old since we
there you
formally
are.
put it together.
Right.
And we've been sort of building up and operating in stealth mode a little bit. In some way, the best news is we've had no trouble finding really excellent young people to come work with.
Really?
A lot of people are excited about this idea, and they really
new
kind of
territory.
get it. And same thing with companies and customers.
Yeah.
And I think you'll be hearing more this
I
spring
think
about
so
what
too.
we're doing. But we're moving along great guns, and it's very exciting. And it's
Yeah.
really an attempt to, the book sort of ends with a description of this is how the world is today.
Yeah.
There's some things we've seen that I think are right, some things I think are less good, and let's figure out how to do it for the future, and how do we begin to tackle this big problem and really, again, ease some of this unease, and do that by being transparent and recognizing that robots are human products, and that they may not always have the right answer.
Yes.
And the person who's on the front line, whose rear end is on the line, who's the one who's in the environment you can see, may have something to add.
Right.
Rather than
very
building
much so.
a car that has
Yeah.
no possibility of the user adding anything.
Yes.
Crazy.
Yeah. Very interesting. Before we close, we're running out of time here, so I want to ask about your background. You've done so many interesting things. I wish we could cover more of it, but you have an interesting academic background where you started out with two different things. Tell us about that, please.
Oh, well, I was always just interested in, I'm a real electrical engineer. I love electronics. I like building electronics. I like building computers. And that interest has never left me. And I always knew I wanted to major in electrical engineering when I was in college. And at the same time, I also have always loved literature and stories and mythology. And so I ended up doing a double major in college in literature and in electrical engineering.
And you were the only one.
I was the only one, yes.
Doing
I've
that.
since met a couple others, actually, but not too many.
Two of them, right.
And then I became a historian. Because, again, I like telling stories about people and technology, but I also like building machines. And the interesting thing about building a company, actually, there's a lot of storytelling involved.
Very interesting.
The book is really about how do we tell stories about people. I mean, if there's one thing you can say about a story, it has a protagonist. And a protagonist is either a person or some being who behaves like a person. And but as we are changing the way we think about who people are and changing the way we think about who robots and things are, you have to think about telling different kinds of stories. Warfare may not be a heroic story anymore in the way that it was. The traditional, I mean, heroism is actually a theme that runs through every single book I've written. Going back to Joseph Campbell, really, which I was reading in high school, which is kind of, to me, the story of the hero's development and the way that the hero relates to the world and goes through trials and ends up at some new destination. And if anything, robots challenge that narrative. And we've got to try to figure out what the new narrative is. So I'm not a literary scholar anymore in my profession, but I still am very much think in literary terms. In that kind of way.
It shows, but also that the sensitivity to the human aspect of this is really interesting too. And one more thing here at MIT, you have so many hats. You do the historical thing, do you still do the aeronautical thing? What is your day like anyway?
Well, a day like today, I ran back and forth across the street on and off campus about 3 times. But everybody at a place like MIT is busy.
I understand that, and has several hats often.
And has a lot of different hats, and people are performing at a very high level, sometimes at too high a level because it really can be stressful and burns people out. And at the same time, I have this enormous privilege where I have a tenured professorship, and so I can do what I love and try to make the best contribution to the world that I can make. And that's a great luxury in today's world. And so that challenges you to really rise to that and take advantage of it and do the best you can.
Yes.
And I get bored easily, so I like to keep myself busy.
Well, you do keep yourself busy.
And I tend to get bored if I do the same thing for too long. So.
Yes. Well, I'm sure this will go on, whatever comes next. It sounds as though it's unstoppable. But in any case, I thank you for this book and others. But this, I think, is really valuable reading for people because we are building a myth about the autonomy of robots, and this is just well timed to sober us up a little bit here, that it's more complicated.
We can write the new myth.
Exactly.
And we don't have to have it written for us by companies
right,
or
media or like that. But so, Dr. Mindell, thank you so much. I really appreciate your talking with us. It's been most interesting.
Thank you.